Hi and welcome to another edition of Mailbag. Okay, this is Mailbag, common feature of the channel. It's where I attempt to answer questions that you guys have left on the channel, or if I can't answer them, I have a good go at answering them, or I throw them out to the wider Tubi community to try and answer on behalf of somebody who's raised the question. Now, we'll get into this mailbag. Remember, like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Go over to Instagram and follow me there. Go over to Facebook, follow me there. That's where the normal notices are. And consider becoming a Patreon. This next this next mailbag item comes from XP50 Player. And it's in response to no workstations before the M1. What about ... And I kind of agree that the D50 was undervalued. And XP50 Player writes, Woody did a couple of videos on the D20. He had a history with, and Woody's, I don't know whether it was the D20 or the D10 that Woody actually played. When he was gigging in a band, he actually played either the D20 or the D10. I can't remember which one it was. But XP50 Player writes, I remember being underwhelmed by it in the shop next to the M1 and the D50. Yes, and I would agree with you on that. But the D50, and the problem with Roland was the D50 wasn't a workstation. The D20 was a workstation. And people get confused. The M1 was a workstation, okay? There's no if, buts, or maybes. The M1 was a workstation. The D20 gets overlooked because of the D50. Anyway, go back to this. But it looks possible to get a fairly rich sound out of it, and 32-note polyphony was nothing to shake a stick at in 1988. So, what did I say? I remember watching the videos a couple of years back. These are the Woody videos. And I might add, this was after I acquired a D20. So I got a D20 quite a few years back after I started rebuilding the studio. In fact, I actually acquired a D10 and a D20. I don't know why I acquired both of them, but I've actually kept both of them, which is really interesting, the fact that I've actually kept both of those machines. Of course, the D50 was not a workstation, which is what I just said. It was an outright synthesizer. And this and the launch of the Core Game 1, I think, really muted the D10 and D20. I have to be honest, the D20 is actually a better all-round instrument than the D50. And many people will be surprised I'm saying that. But the D50 is a better synth. And I'm making a really clear distinction here. If you want an outright synth, D50. If you want an all-round machine, D20. It's just on the D50 you can manipulate more of the sound parameters to construct the sound. If you ever see anything I've done with the PG-1000, look at the number of parameters on the PG-1000, and I will do some stuff with the PG-10, which is the editor for the D20 and the D10, and you'll see how few parameters you can actually change within the LA algorithm on the D20. I never thought Roland actually drove through the differences between a synth and a workstation. In fact, I don't think many people really understood the differences between a synth and a workstation. Remember, at this point in the 80s, we really didn't have instruments that you would call a workstation. Yes, I know there were some ensoniq instruments around, but there weren't, what we now regard, the Cronoses, the Phantoms, the Montages of this world, true workstations. Okay, you can do many, many things with them. But back in this point in time, you bought a synth, you bought a sequencer, you bought a drum machine. And this is why I don't think musicians really understood what the difference was between the D50 and the D20. If they did, I think the D20 would have sold much better. If you rocked up to your local Roland dealer in 1988 with your £1,500 in your pocket, because that's how much it cost in the UK, you would be steered towards the D50, as every pop band that was making music at that point in time was using one, and it retailed at $14.45, which left you enough money in your pocket for a night out with your girlfriend or a Roland pedal. But sitting somewhere in the shop would have been the D20 that had rhythms, it had a sequencer, it had 32-note poly, which the D50 didn't, or 8-note poly if you started layering sounds, and at £12.45 it had enough for a holiday with your aforementioned girlfriend. Or memory cards for your D20. You wouldn't have seen this on top of the pops because they wanted to showcase the D50, especially after the arrival of the Korg M1. So Roland were desperate to get the D50 off the shelves once the M1 arrived, because people were then starting to wake up to what a workstation could do. I mean, the M1 is a powerful synthesizer, but it's also a powerful workstation. Or it was in those days. Still is, to be honest. In terms of the sound, yes, some of the presets are a little weak, but with tweaks from the programmer, it was respectable. And I knew a few players from my youth that used this keyboard. So, like Woody, I never could afford a D20. I didn't have the £1,500 lying around in my bank account to look at a D50, or the £1,250 to look at a D20. I just wasn't that rich in this point in time. I mean, I'm looking 1988. I would have been 18. Actually, 1988, most of 1988, I would have been 17, and I just acquired a car. And as people know, you know, when you get your own set of wheels, that's so important to you as a teenager. So I didn't have the money to drive around and buy a D20, even second hand at that point. But what they did do is they chose, a lot of people chose the D10 chose the D20 over the D10. And the reason they did it, had a disk drive. You didn't have to have cards. So at that point in time, if you wanted to back a synthesizer up, you either did a SysX dump to a computer, which was in those days an Atari ST, a Commodore Amiga, or some other 8/16-bit machine. 16-bit if you were lucky, 8-bit if you were sort of coming through the 80s, because that's what the machines were. And you didn't really want to do a SysX to a computer because it just took an utter age to transmit the sounds backwards and forward. So if you were gigging, reality was you ended up buying the Roland memory cards, which weren't cheap at the time. But if you had a disk drive, you could go and buy a box of 10 discs for £10. Problem solved. And that allowed them to buy tones and swap tones and do all the other stuff. And basically you could load tones into the D20 in as much time as it took the singer to distract the crowd by having a quick chat with them. So you could do a few songs, and you always wondered why the singer would then take a point to actually sort of have a conversation. Well, the reality was the keyboard player was loading the new sounds into the synth.